right, it would appear that we are live. So, on the issue that it should be illegal to Photoshop models in advertisements, so basically, the way I want to start off is just asking a pretty simple question. At what point is it appropriate for a state to intervene in order to restrict what advertisers can and cannot show? What I'm going to base this principle on is some examples that we can already see that have been implemented in advertising. So I was quickly looking at the Federal Trade Commission's website this morning to see the kinds of things that are restricted in advertising. And the current things that they have restrictions on is basically truth claims. So you can't out and out lie on an advertisement. And then it also, it kind of has a number of subsections to that to do with children, endorsements, environmental marketing, health claims, and stuff like that. So the underlying principle that would seem to be there is that you have to be truthful in the advertising that you're promoting. That you cannot lie to consumers in order to try to get them to believe something or buy the product. Are people able to hear me okay? I hear that my audio is a little bit out.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
Okay, I can hear you great.
Okay, fantastic. All right, I'm just gonna try to lower the volume a little bit of the device because I'm being pinged a little bit to say that that is an issue.
I'm hearing a little bit of feedback, but it's not horrendous.
Okay, well, hopefully you can just sort of keep going. So that's the first claim that I think it's reasonable to sort of restrict advertising, is that in cases where there is out and out deception. I think that if we then sort of perhaps branch out from the United States and look to other countries, say for some laws that we have here in Australia, for example, where the advertising of tobacco is very heavily restricted, that just general interests of public safety and public well-being are the kinds of things where the government is able to step in, acting as a sort of consumer watchdog, sort of looking out for their best interests. So along that point, I sort of have 2 points for why I think that it should be illegal to Photoshop models and advertisements. The first one is to do with deception, which is that if we want to just sort of characterize a little bit the degree to which Photoshopping models does actually take place, the sort of before and after shots of like where the before shot is just like a photograph of the person and the after shot is that image once it has been, edited and photoshopped and all these other sorts of things, is that they exist as two completely different images. Like the sort of the end product Photoshop is basically a sort of impression of the first one, insofar as that every single line, every single pixel, everything has been manipulated in some way. And actually, the interesting thing is that if you were to take just a photo of a model that was about to be photoshopped and crop out the top half and put just like a picture of a duck there, right? And then compare that with that same photo that had been heavily photoshopped, there would be more pixels that are accurate within the first photo that had been half cropped into a duck than there would be in the second photo. So the degree to which there is a huge amount of manipulation that goes on means that there is a certain amount of implicit deception that is being taken place there. Because when people see these advertisements, they think that even if they, are aware that, it might have been photoshopped a little bit, like there might have been some alignments or some touch-up, I think it's quite unclear to most people just the extent to which that photoshopping actually sort of takes place. And so I think that that's a pretty clear case for some sort of deception. I think the second principle that you should look at here in terms of acting in the public's interest or the interest of public safety is that there has been lots of research that to suggest that these kinds of images, specifically the ways that models get photoshopped to appear very thin, often much thinner than is healthy or even in some cases humanly possible, has sort of contributed to this negative body image that in a lot of ways affects women, and specifically young women, quite drastically. And there is some evidence to suggest that is a contributing factor to the rise of eating disorders like bulimia and anorexia. And so in the case where this is a sort of externality that is a public health concern, it seems like a pretty reasonable place for the government to step in to try to sort of alleviate some of that. So those are sort of my opening thoughts on the matter. I'm happy to pass it over to you.
I am not in disagreement in principle. There's lots of things that I think that, and you can still hear me okay?
Yep.
There's lots of things that I think it's the prerogative, so to speak, of the government to make illegal for the greater good. I mean, that's the way that a democracy works. The democracy doesn't serve the minority very well. It has the interest of the majority at heart primarily. But what you have introduced here, as I perceive it, is something slightly different than the ostensible subject or proposition of this debate, which is it should be illegal to Photoshop models and advertisements. That's very, very broad. If it had been, it should be illegal to Photoshop models and advertisements for purposes of deception, I would have agreed with it straight away and elected not to participate in the debate because that's sort of a no-brainer. But was this proposition something that you came up with, or was it one that was just on the list?
This was just a debate that I said I was happy to debate.
Okay. So we both made assumptions about what this proposition actually entailed. My assumption was probably more specific, or naturally more broad. You know, I took it literally. It should be illegal to Photoshop models and advertisements, which would be sort of asinine to have any government regulation that was that broad, because there's plenty of reason to Photoshop a model and advertisement that doesn't involve self-deception at all. Maybe they're adjusting color balance. Maybe they decide that they wish she was wearing a different color of lip gloss, et cetera, et cetera. You just disappeared. Are you still there? Hello? We are apparently having a technical difficulty. I don't see you at all. I'm going to refresh here. Okay. It says waiting for switchlurk to start the head-to-head debate. But currently, we are not having a debate because you are not visible on my screen.
Okay.
And presumably.
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay. Where did I leave off? What's the last?
Sorry. The last thing I heard was, so you were talking about that your conception of the debate was just a bit more broad.
Well, I was saying that there's actually many reasons that it would be reasonable for to Photoshop models in an advertisement that wouldn't involve deception at all. Maybe you're adjusting the color balance. Maybe you need to tweak the gamma a little bit. Maybe you wish that she wore a different color of lip gloss with that dress. Now, if, as you said, and you're 100% correct, if you're hawking a weight loss product and you artificially make the person look thinner via Photoshop in the after shot, and there's the before the fat person, and in the after shot she looks 20-30 pounds lighter, or he looks 20-30 pounds lighter, and they are not indeed lighter. That should be illegal. But for me, there's a couple of other issues involved. Before I present them, I'm going to pass it back to you to respond to what I've said.
Okay. Yeah, certainly. So I think it would seem that we're in agreement that there are certain areas where it would be unacceptable to allow advertisers to manipulate images in a certain way. I think that perhaps a reasonable way that we can proceed with this debate is to have you sort of explain where, so you've already sort of highlighted a couple of areas in terms of just sort of color balance and correction and sort of minor kind of color tweaks in that. Perhaps you can elaborate on some other examples where you think it would be reasonable. And then what I think the case would be is that it's hard to sort of legislate in a way that specifically calls out examples, that doesn't give advertisers loopholes to sort of maneuver around and interpret legislation in a way that is going to ultimately allow them to do the things that they want to do. So my perspective would be that maybe it is a case where there is, that if I was to sort of propose this as legislation, that there would be some sort of unintended externalities, like you couldn't color correct or anything anymore. My contention would be is that it's more important that we protect the consumer base against deception, and that it's more important that we try to curb social harms associated with eating disorders than we maintain some of these other sort of things. So I'm happy to have the debate sort of go in that direction if you want to elaborate.
No problem. There's so many problems with that for me, and I hate the fact that a young woman or a young man suffers from bulimia, anorexia, etc. I hate that. I am slightly beyond chubby. You can't necessarily tell from my headshot here, but I'm a fat ass, okay? I am. And I have been for 30 years. I don't pay a whole bunch of attention to what supermodels look like. And I don't think that that's necessarily gender-based. I just don't personally. Some women don't either. My wife really could give a shit, pardon my French there, what a supermodel wears. Doesn't ever even pay any attention. She could care less about Kim Kardashian's boobs or anything else. But the problem that I have, even though I think it's a negative consequence of Photoshop manipulation, is sort of, where do we draw the line? When I go to the gym, and I do go to the gym, I walk into the gym, and invariably there's a lot of people who look pretty fantastic and who intimidate me. I'm on the treadmill and they're on the treadmill, and I'm thinking to myself, why in God's name do you need to be in the treadmill? You don't have as much body fat in your whole body as I have in my left butt cheek. So, why? Does that mean that because I feel insecure, or maybe go home and starve myself because I've been exposed to this Adonis at the gym, that people who are hotter than I am shouldn't be allowed to go to the gym? To me, that's the same thing. What about cosmetic surgery? Should models therefore not be able to get cosmetic surgery because it sets an unreasonable expectation for somebody else? And I'm not talking about the collagen injections that make you look like a freak show, but I live in South Korea, which is probably there's probably a higher percentage of men and women who get cosmetic surgery here than any place in the world. And frankly, if you're sitting on the subway here in Korea, you will see so many beautiful people that it's scary. But a lot of them sort of look the same because they've been to plastic surgeons who were doing the similar or identical procedures. Should you be able to wear Spanx as a model? Should you be able to wear high heels for cosmetics? There's lots of different examples that I could give, but it's your turn.
Certainly. So I think that to sort of address this perhaps slightly slippery slope kind of argument where it says, you know, how far can we reasonably go sort of to try to just, you know, affect people's ideas of beauty and have them not sort of adversely affected by these beauty standards. I have a couple of points on the things that you were saying. The first thing that you mentioned is that your wife doesn't particularly care about what supermodels look like, and you in fact don't particularly care about what supermodels look like. Sort of kind of making the point here that, you know, while some people might internalize the things that people are, you know, the images that appear in advertising, other people don't as much. I think that the point here is that, yes, might that be true, that might be certain individuals who are very sort of like advertising has no effect on them whatsoever. I think that it's harder to draw an exact one-to-one comparison to the degree to which advertising does affect any one individual, because the way that advertising disseminates itself throughout culture is not always readily apparent, where there are sort of internalized like understandings of, you know, just like what you expect to see on a billboard. It can affect what your perception of like an ideal like form is, or what, you know, peak beauty is, or all these sorts of things, which are not readily apparent and perhaps can be quite hard to unpack within someone's own mind. So I think that, you know, even if people recognize that these images have been photoshopped and they're like, because of that, I'm not going to care about them, simply recognizing that sometimes isn't enough, that these things can often kind of work their way into the public conscious in sort of pernicious ways. The second thing I wanted to talk to you about, sort of listing your examples about, you know, what about people going to the gym? What about people who have had cosmetic surgery? What about people who just dress really well? And all these other sorts of stuff. I have a couple of responses to this. Perhaps not so much for the cosmetic surgery stuff, but at least for the gym and for the people dressing really attractively. The benefit there, as opposed to advertising, is that there is some degree of realism, right? Like these people do actually sort of look like that, even though they might have, you know, spent a lot of money or spent a lot of time and effort to get that kind of physical form. They are actually achieving something that is humanly possible, whereas there are several examples in advertisement where things have been photoshopped beyond even human possibility, right? You have like, there are instances where models have been photoshopped to have waists like smaller than their heads, like the kind of body configurations that would actually make your internal organs like shut down or something like that. So I think that the harm is sort of mitigated there in a way, because at least there is some degree of, you know, like actual sort of attainability. The second thing that I would say is that at least within the context of seeing people in this broader society, that's not as damaging a harm, because there is also still diversity. So while it may be the case that you and I can go to a gym, see someone who's like really ripped and be like, oh, I'm feeling a bit self-conscious now because of that guy, we might also see the guy at the gym who does look a little bit more like us and is kind of just like an average Joe trying to sort of work themselves out and get into that better spot. And we sort of gain this kind of dual understanding of like, okay, there are people that look like that, and there are also people who look a little bit more like us. The problem with advertising is because everyone is so concerned with always trying to associate their product with the ideal form of beauty or the ideal sort of human form, you're never going to get that same kind of diversity and plurality in advertising as you do get in other spaces in general life. So while it might be potentially harmful, you at least have the other mitigating factor of having other people that look more like you, so that you can get a more nuanced conception of the wide range that people can look. And then my third response to that would be just saying that I think that obviously the problem with that, and this kind of addresses your slippery slope argument of like, where do you draw the line, is that obviously if we were to ban people from going to the gym or ban people getting plastic surgery, that's a massive infringement on personal liberty. Whereas in order to try to implement this, all that we're doing is placing restrictions on corporations who already have a multitude of other ways to try to advertise their products and do their own sort of things. That the sort of cost benefit swings a little bit differently, where we don't have to, tell someone specifically the things that they can and can't do and implement that on a state level versus just placing restrictions that are already kind of in line with the kinds of restrictions that advertisements have to follow. So I think that in the question of where do you draw the line, that is where you draw the line. When there is a massive infringement on personal liberty, then that is unacceptable. But in sort of furthering constraints that you already have on advertisers, that's something where I'd be happy to go. I think that the question that I maybe just have for you before I pass it back is that you were also saying that there might be some, what I'm curious about is, what do you see as the main harms that would accrue from this policy? What is the worst thing that would happen by advertisers not being allowed to Photoshop their images anymore?
That's a hard question. I'll think about it. As I state that I agree with most of what you said, well, probably all of what you said. What is the most harm? Okay, there isn't any significant harm. If they decided tomorrow that you couldn't Photoshop models or even possibly in advertisements, period, my life and your life and the life of the average citizen is not going to be harmed in any way. I don't know if that is in itself enough. There's lots of things that the government can't ban or wouldn't think about banning that also wouldn't harm me in particular. Put it this way: if the government decided tomorrow to ban the consumption of cornflakes, and I love cornflakes, it really wouldn't affect me that much. Or, they could ban, the list is long, but that doesn't mean that they should do it. It's still a good argument.
Okay, so maybe not strict harm, but just you mentioned before, say for example, that advertisers couldn't color correct anymore. Are there any more examples like that you were thinking of that would be things that advertisers wouldn't be able to do anymore that actually would be good if they were able to do them?
Well, think of all of the advertisements. Okay, maybe you have an advertising campaign that is, as many of them are nowadays, that have some sort of a storyline or they're funny. And maybe your advertisement, you know who Cyrano de Bergerac is, I'm assuming, the long-nosed. If you've ever seen the Steve Martin movie from years ago, he was a fireman, and he had this really long nose that people teased him about. But anyway, so if you were making a commercial and you were featuring Cyrano de Bergerac, and you wanted to put a long honking nose on him, well, you couldn't unless you used some sort of a prosthetic. If you had an advertisement that involved aliens, as in from outer space, you couldn't Photoshop that, which is the way they do things anymore. Very, very seldom, unless it's in a World of Warcraft movie or something like that, do they actually put on massive prosthetic. That word. But I have a question for you. Do you know what the fairness doctrine was?
No, I'm not familiar with that.
Well, it was a U.S. thing, and you're in Australia.
Yeah.
So I don't know whether they have or had anything similar in Australia, but this is no more in the U.S., and to me, it's a huge mistake to have abolished it. But the fairness doctrine for all of my teens, probably into my early 20s, maybe even into my 30s, I'm not sure when it was abolished, required equal time in the news. So you couldn't broadcast a story that was critical of Muslims without allowing somebody else to come on and give the opposite viewpoint. And that was on any subject. It didn't make any difference what it was. And then, I know this maybe is one extrapolation too far, but you were talking about mitigation. What could mitigate? Well, I would much prefer that the government came out and said, well, for every supernaturally thin woman that you have on TV, you need to have one that looks like the average person. You need to have one that looks like Maud and Agnes, the lady sitting in the laundromat folding her clothes sort of thing. Realistically shaped and sized people. I think that would be better all the way around than forbidding a photo manipulation technique, or a video photo manipulation technique.
Certainly.
Back to you.
Okay, yeah, cool. So I have some thoughts on that as well. I think that, so firstly, in regards to your point about it, perhaps restricting, the creative process of people, how if you want to put, I did actually Google Cyrano de Bergerac now, and I can see the person that you're referring to with the very kind of like pantomime sort of nose. Mm-hmm. My response to that would be in terms of creative ideals. Specifically, the wording of this topic and presumably the wording of the policy that would be put into place is that it should be illegal to Photoshop models in advertisements. I would think that maybe it's a little bit not in the spirit of the debate, but I would say that perhaps there is a way that if a similar piece of policy was to be implemented, that people would still be able to do things to find workarounds, either by the use of prosthetics or actually just having completely computer generated images sort of like put in over the top of otherwise, sort of normal scenes and stuff. And I think that the benefit of that is that when you make it sort of obviously fake to people, you really don't accrue any of the harms that that I'm claiming that happen when you manipulate the images of people that are supposed to kind of look like they're still people, but actually are not. So if you just sort of staple like a big cartoon alien over an advertisement stuff, the people aren't going to have the same sort of response as they do seeing a Photoshop model, because those things are clearly fake. And so if people wanted to find these workarounds in that sort of way, I think that would be okay with. But in sort of fairness to the topic, let's broaden it out and say that, that we would just completely get rid of any kind of photoshopping from advertising at all. That if you wanted to have a piece, then you had to just perfectly like photograph the thing that is there. I think that in that case, again, the sort of use of prosthetics and stuff could potentially mitigate that. But then I would also just say that I think that, looking for the kind of like advertisements as a kind of outlet of creative expression, perhaps once again is a harm that I am willing to cop. I think that there are tons of other places where creative people are able to exhibit that sort of creativity, that if we're looking to like advertisements as like this great expression of human art, that perhaps we should be looking to other places for those sort of expressions of creativity. Some thoughts on what you were saying about the Fairness Act. Just quickly before I pass it back. And I do actually know what you're referring to now, because I remember watching a video about it. The problem with any kind of on balance sort of like kind of handing over to the industry saying, okay, well now you have to fulfill these restrictions, where for every unnaturally thin model that you show, you also have to show a regular sized person. The problem with sort of like placing those kinds of restrictions on the industry, where you're just like, you just have to have it on balance, is that there are a lot of ways that people within the industry, and in fact people will be probably paid a lot of money to try to figure out ways to circumnavigate that that still benefits what they're trying to do. So I believe that America did a similar sort of thing where they paid or made it that tobacco advertisers had to pay for advertisements for anti-smoking campaigns as a kind of way of sort of mitigating the harm that they were causing. And if you look at some of the ads that came out from that, they're so hilariously bad that it seems kind of obvious that they were done to try to like persuade people that smoking is actually cool. Like they had taglines something along the lines of like, you know, if you're not smoking, the only harm you'll get is that you won't be the coolest kid in school or something. Like they were so obviously bad that it actually probably pushed more people into being like, this is anti-smoking is dumb. I'm just going to go grab a pack of cigarettes, which is probably what the companies wanted in the first place. So I think you fall into a dangerous trap when you allow corporations to sort of do this to themselves. And I think that, you know, if I was to extrapolate a way that this could potentially happen in the advertising industry, that the easiest way that I could see it happening is that you just get a kind of play up and play down effect. So like, you know, you have your sort of like average size, like, you know, normal person model maybe being put on like different time slots or in the back of like magazines that nobody really reads, or maybe they're just kind of like sent up or like made fun of in a way that actually reinforces the, you know, supernaturally thin kind of beauty standard. And I think that the problem is that even if you were to implement a similar sort of action now, we already exist in the context where that beauty standard has been established. And so people are always going to sort of weight that beauty standard and those supernaturally thin ads more than they would the, you know, average person kind of ad.
My dog is wanting attention here.
That's fair.
I've never been a smoker, so I haven't really paid that much attention to the smoking ads. But advertisements on television for smoking have been illegal for a long time in the U.S. I think actually since the 1970s. But I think you're right. I think there was a fund set up that the tobacco industry had, and that paid for anti-smoking advertisements, but not that appeared on television. Maybe they did. So what was forbidden was advertisements promoting. And I think even in motion pictures that weren't rated R or something, I don't remember. But in actual fact, smoking in the U.S. is extremely unpopular now. Not that people still don't do it, but the effectiveness of these anti-smoking ads, even if they were done in a farcical or comical manner, is demonstrated in the vast reduction in the number of people who smoke. But I still concede your point. I don't know where I was going to go after that.
That's fair.
One of the problems with these is there's not a very convenient place other than a notepad on your screen to put a note to remind yourself. So,
yeah, that is a bit tricky.
So, go for it.
Yeah, so let's see. What were some of the things I was going to talk about? I guess sort of harking back to a point you were saying way before in the debate about, you know, color correction and things like that. I think that maybe it's just worthy to note that, you know, if it was the case that that we wouldn't be able to sort of color correct lip glosses or you know, clothing or other sort of things like that, that maybe that once again is not necessarily a bad thing or a harm. That in fact you actually just get that the consumers get a more accurate idea of how you know, a certain product is going to look on a person, rather than you know, having this elaborately sort of like set up thing where the colors look really bright and everything sort of looks quite shiny. That perhaps, you know, if we were to sort of push in this direction, just kind of restricting the degree to which, the kind of pomp and circumstance that advertisers are able to put on their products might actually be a good thing in terms of just giving people a more realistic idea of how the kind of products that they're going to buy are going to look. I think that perhaps if to breach away from that for a second and maybe talk a little bit more about the idea of what you were saying about, again, placing kind of restrictions or the Fairness Act being placed on advertisers. Already sort of elaborating on how I think that there are problems asking the industry themselves to like implement their own policy that would cause them to give equal airtime or something like that. I think that in perhaps like a more general sense, if someone was to propose, why wouldn't these industries, is it not reasonable to expect these industries to sort of self-regulate in some sort of way? And in fact, there was a paper that I was looking at that was looking at the links between advertising and eating disorders, to say that that basically that drew the conclusion that there might be some impact on eating disorders, but there's not a sort of provable amount in a psychological sense, which I think is sort of fair enough. But I think that, as I sort of explained earlier, I think the connection between advertising as it leads to culture, as it leads to cultural expectations, is not something that is always necessarily very easy to see the kind of connections of. And so it can kind of, happen in a sort of roundabout kind of way. But the thing that this kind of paper suggests is to saying that in this sense, therefore, marketers need to be self-regulating and rely on their ethical standards to enforce the degree to which they show these sorts of things. I think the main problem there is, so this is the kind of thing, right, is that people might say, well, advertisers are good people. They don't want to, give young children eating disorders. Like if you make a whole population feel really awful and bad about themselves, that's not going to be a happy population that wants to sort of buy your stuff. I think that the one thing to note here is that the main problem with any kind of self-regulation, and which in turn probably provides a justification for why it's necessary for the government to step in and impose these kinds of things, is that advertising inherently exists in this kind of arm race scenario where advertisers are competing against each other to try to appeal to a consumer base. And in order to do that, you kind of that has a tendency to lean towards sensationalization, right? In the same way that we see from like media outlets and other things like that, where it's always going to be the case that it's going to be difficult for advertisers to say, well, let's kind of just bring it back a bit and kind of like move towards these more realistic depictions of people, because at the same time that they're doing that, their competitors are always going to be thinking, well, we can get more sort of attention if we go further towards the other end of the spectrum and push models who look even more otherworldly and even more superhuman by doing these sorts of things. So I think that there's a natural incentive for advertisers there to always push towards the spectrum that is the most sensational, the most otherworldly, the most unlike humans, which means it's going to be very difficult to ever say that, well, you can just sort of place reasonable restrictions and expect the advertisers to follow these. I think that the only way that you can effectively, if in fact we do agree that it is a problem, that there is this deception and manipulation going on, that the only way that you can effectively combat that is to place these kind of strict restrictions to which people aren't really able to circumnavigate. So that was just some thoughts on that.
I agree with you to an extent. Advertisers, I believe absolutely that if they could bring out advertisements that encouraged anorexia and bulimia, as long as it made them an extra buck, would do it. I don't think that that it's an ethical industry at all. But the fairness stuff I referred to earlier wasn't a voluntary thing. It was imposed by the federal government. I don't know why it went away. Probably a couple of senators had their palms greased by, I'm being serious here, by industry.
Quite
Maybe.
potentially. So when I actually heard about the fairness doctrine, the thing that I heard that was the problem with it is that it kind of gave a unfair weighting to things that perhaps didn't actually deserve it. So, for example, if you had someone talking about climate science and how global warming is happening and how the Earth is heating up, then you also had to give equal time to a climate denier who's saying like, no, well, that doesn't work because the Earth is 3,000 years old and everything's controlled by aliens.
Right.
And so that kind of unfair weighting is what I heard was kind of the main problems with it. And necessarily,
that might be. I don't know. I've lived outside of the United States for 19 years, not all in one stretch. So I'm a little behind on. It went away when I was out of the country. So I am a U.S. citizen. I'm 56, so 19 years isn't a whole bunch of time out of 56 years, but it's enough that I'm not as up on the whys and whens. I didn't know who Michael J. Fox was when I watched Back to the Future, to give an example. I had no clue. I didn't know he was ever in a television series, so there are just some things that... So, I'd like to mention the uncanny valley because you were talking about layovers.
Yeah.
And I sort of, that's not a bad idea. Because right now, did you watch, are you a Star Wars fan?
Yes.
So I loved Rogue One.
Yeah.
And I love The Force Awakens. And they still had a few uncanny valley moments for me. With Carrie Fisher and I'm forgetting the name of the actor, the stern-faced gentleman. Maybe I only had that uncanny valley moment because I knew that it was very expensive CGI. As long as we are in the sort of this moment in computer graphic technology that the people are not indistinguishable, the simulated persons are not indistinguishable from you or I, that would work. But we're not very far off. Probably.
Yeah. So if I can, so I think that is the point that you're trying to get at. That it's like there already is a kind of natural restriction to how far advertisers can push these things, because if they push it too far, it just looks so unhuman that people actually start to get freaked out. You have that uncanny valley system.
Yeah, essentially.
Yeah, so I think that's pretty reasonable. I think why that can potentially be dangerous in Photoshop and like photo advertising specifically is because a lot of that uncanny valley stuff comes it becomes a lot more apparent when things are in motion and when things are moving. So if you were just to see like a still photo of the CGI General Tarkin or Princess Leia, you actually could be forgiven to be like, oh yeah, this is actually pretty okay. But it's once they start to kind of like move their mouths and have those facial expressions that you're like,
the mouths, yeah,
something's not quite right? Like it's always the mouth or the eyes that kind of do it. But while those are still, it's actually not too bad. So the dangerous thing there is that I think that advertisers can actually push pretty far in that direction. Having and already like it's easier to also kind of cover that up by like stylizing the context around where the advertising has taken place. So maybe they do look a little bit uncanny valley, but if you have the rest of the advertised kind of like stylized in this weird sort of dream sense or whatever, people might be a little bit more to be like, oh yeah, that kind of makes sense in the context. So I think that potentially is a harm or a risk rather about why you can't necessarily rely on just on that to not push too far. I think that just to sort of elaborate also on your fairness policy that you're talking about of like giving equal screen time. I think perhaps another harm that just kind of accrues from that is the idea of like, so maybe I can say that yes, it would be good if we could see more average person representation on screen. the interesting thing there is that it still kind of, you know, admits that the thing that is harmful are these unrealistic depictions of people, and the way that you combat that is realistic depictions of people. So if the unrealistic depictions are still harmful, then you're just pushing the harm from being like 100% of unrealistic expectations to 50% of unrealistic expectations. And now the sort of like cure for that is being like 50% as opposed to it can just be 100%. So if it's the case where we would say, oh, well, we would just make it 50-50. If we both agree that 50% of those are problematic, why not just push the whole way, you know, and make it 100?
I am, and this could be a generational thing. I'm very an adamant civil libertarian. I come from a generation within my lifetime in the U.S. You had Nazi parades proposed through Jewish communities, and in those years, the protesters who showed up, while they hated the Nazis, were protesting for their right to have parades in Jewish communities. The American Civil Liberties Union supported the rights of the Nazis to hold parades in Jewish neighborhoods. Today, we have sort of the opposite thing. I can't think of his name. He's a blonde-haired douchebag who used to write for BuzzFeed. He might still do.
This is the Milo Yiannopoulos thing that got shut down on the campus. Yeah.
And university students should be extremely embarrassed to have protested to curtail someone else's right to free speech. That's not what free speech is about. And I guess that, yes, I am equating free speech with the right of an advertiser to do reasonable photo manipulation. I don't think that I would want to go as far as what you're suggesting. Even if there's the danger. I mean, that's what fines are for. And advertisers don't like fines. And fine the networks as well. And that would be the real solution. Because if you're a network who's getting paid $umpteen million a minute to air a commercial, but that you know that you're going to lose money instead of make money by showing a commercial that violates the spirit of the legislation. I'm a spirit of the law person versus the letter of the law person. I think that would be all that we would need to do.
I mean, potentially. It's hard, though, because you need to make sure that those fines are actually going to lose that company money. Because they could just as easily do the cost analysis and say, well, we're going to lose this much money for getting fined. But actually, all of our advertisers reckon that this advertising campaign is going to bring in this much revenue. So actually, the revenue just minus the fine still leaves us with a whole profit of money. And there's been cases in recent history before where that's happened, where advertisers have been taken to court for, you know, fallacious advertising and say, you lied here, right? You're going to take a big fine. And they're like, yep, okay, here's the fine. We still made this much revenue from running this ad campaign. And so,
well, the advertisers wouldn't be the people who would be getting the fines. I'm proposing that the people who show those ads.
Yeah, but like the companies, once again, they hired the advertisers and then they paid the fines as well. But they're also the people who are paying the fines are still the people who bring in the revenue.
Right.
So it's still their cost analysis benefit of
that. You know, that's a possibility. I mean, very definitely it happens. Matter of fact, it happens too much.
Yeah,
I just had get an example of it.
Yeah. I can't remember the exact examples off the top of my head, but there's a show, Adam Ruins Everything, which I think plays in the US on True TV or something, that has a couple of episodes where they detail some of that stuff, if people are interested in looking it up.
When I lived in the UK, when I first lived there, I lived there for 11 years, you couldn't sell virtually anything on a Sunday. As a matter of fact, most shops were shut on a Sunday. But if you were a home improvement store, you could be open. God knows why. You couldn't buy Bibles or ice cream on a Sunday, but you could buy a list of other peculiar things. And basically, if you were a major supermarket or something like that, and you elected to stay open on a Sunday, there were enormous fines. But the retailers looked and went, well, we'll still make more money than the fines are. But that's a correctable thing. You just take all of the profits,
Certainly.
plus, or double it. Say for every day that you're open, we'll not only take all the money you make, we'll take it twice.
So my question to you is that what exactly is the difference between enormous fines that no one would ever consider breaking the law in order to pay and just making something illegal? Like, surely at that stage, it's still the state saying you can't do this thing. In one case, it's that, and like if it's fining, then surely in order to fine someone, then it has to be illegal in the first place, right? They have to be in violation of some law. So
well, because I wouldn't be fining them for all photo manipulation, video manipulation. I'd be fining them when a tribunal decided that yes, this advertisement was deceiving people in order to make profit. And to me, that's fairly significant difference.
Yeah. I mean, I think you run into problems with things like tribunal, or if you take these people to court or some other sort of thing like that, wherein that you might have a tribunal that's sort of arguing for the side of like, let's stop people trying to deceive people. But surely these companies would also have their own advocates to say, this is fine. And in case, if it's actually within a court of law or something like that, you probably have lawyers, very well-paid lawyers, who'd be quite good at what they do, trying to argue that, actually that should be fine. And I think that we can see in other kind of cases that sort of like allowing companies to put forward their case for why they're doing is actually fine has led to a lot of problems. Just while we have a couple of seconds left in the debate, I think I want to just touch on your free speech point. So I don't think that advertisers and I don't think that companies are people, and I don't think that free speech sort of extends to them. I think that if we value free speech, we should be valuing the liberty of individuals within a society, and then the government should act to protect